Warning: this show is intended for mature audiences only. Viewers' discretion is advised. This show may contain strong language and sensitive or controversial topics. We are not attorneys and are not providing legal advice. The views and conversations are our own thoughts and feelings, and therefore, purely speculation.
The entertainment world and beyond.
Skywalker air miles, feeding on a surface, gliding on water, constricted and conflicted.
Welcome to Purely Speculation, a show that exposes the harmful effects of the criminal legal system. I'm your host, Heather Lewis, the Executive Director of the Reuniting Family Bail Fund and practitioner of participatory defense. On this show, you learn about the unspoken horrors of the criminal justice system and meet fierce allies and advocates. We will make the best of our traumatic experiences. We will get angry. We may even cry. We most certainly going to laugh, but one thing's for sure, we're going to keep it real. Welcome to Purely Speculation.
When they free my sins and let them loose, they was killing me, I got scars to prove, got me paralyzed, I could even barely move. Out the way I took the pain again.
Hey, y'all. Welcome. Season 3, episode 10. We are, I can't believe we're almost, third quarter into this year. And yesterday, first of all, real quick, just quick moment of silence for D'Angelo, who lost his battle with pancreatic cancer. Kept that very private. Another brother that we lost to pancreatic cancer. So please, men and women, get your checkups and be mindful of your health. But on today, since yesterday was a holiday that has become controversial in some regard, but Columbus Day. Columbus Day was initially founded by President Benjamin Harrison in 1862 in response to the lynching of 11 Italian prisoners. The lynching occurred after a police chief in New Orleans was killed by 4 men near his home, and they had thought he had said that it was Italian immigrants that attacked him. And so in true mob fashion of those times and how the violence against people that were different than the colonizers, a mob went to the jail where these 4 men were held and grabbed everybody. Everybody that looked Italian, possibly Italian, or maybe it was just all Italian men that were in that prison at the time, but they pulled all 11 of them out and lynched them. And so when you talk about lynching, it's not just, it doesn't happen to just Black folks. But we are here today, and we have my favorite history teacher, Xaras Collins, back, and we're gonna make it do what it do, because I love the conversations that we have about history and the things that we get to talk about. It ignites my blurred, right? So, and it's like, it's just such an interesting topic to see how things evolve. So I understand. I don't know that I could be a history teacher. You and I talk, my memory's bad. I don't retain the information, as I read it. But, as we have these conversations, it sticks, and it just makes me want to all right, well, what's this? And then, you go down a rabbit hole. So before we go down that rabbit hole, welcome, X. Thank you so much for agreeing to come back and have this conversation about so-called Columbus Day these days, right? And how the origins of it, how it all came to be, and where we're going, right? I think that's probably one of the things we really want to explore is where we're going. Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day. I've talked to Indigenous people and they said, we don't even want Indigenous Peoples Day. There's nothing to be celebrated. So before we go down that, welcome. How you doing? Oh, you're on mute, honey.
There you go. Okay. Hi, Heather. I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me back. So Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day. In 2025, actually for the last several years, you can go back to the movement to rename schools or to rename from football teams to products, to remove those names if it was felt deemed derogatory, right? That's been the last couple years. Matter of fact, I saw earlier this afternoon that there's a senator in Pennsylvania that is putting forth a proposal to, follow in the way of professional sports teams, and putting some policy in place, even as we speak, about how indigenous peoples, natives names have been used and carried on in without their permission, really. And I just wrapped up my changes in the Western Frontier, the closing of the frontier, the final Indian Wars, Wounded Knee, Battle of Little Bighorn. I just wrapped all that up with my students, and it fell right with yesterday being Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day.
Before you go on, so 1862 is when, my quick Google search and, read here, read there, go here, click on some names. And it's an interesting timeline of how this holiday even came to be. And I'm pretty sure, because I'm today years old, okay, about the origin of Columbus Day. We always knew Columbus Day, like, Christopher Columbus and discovering America, right? That's the premise, what we know, and most people just think. I would bet that not too many people really know how this came to be. Well, I just read that statistic of how it came to be, as to why there were 11 Italians in 1862 that were lynched. And so Benjamin Harrison was intended to be a one-off, like just to kind of appease the people, appease the Italian. Now, mind you, and again, there's so many directions we can go with this, because 11 Italians got lynched. Here it is, the president of the United States at the time creates a holiday around, this unfortunate incident. Meanwhile, Black Americans 4,000 have been lynched between like 1870 and 1960 or 1950. 4,000 Black Americans, and not a peep. But, we digress. So in my findings, my today years old, elementary school research about Columbus Day. So the next thing that happens is that in 1934, and you'll give me your expert opinion as the bona fide history teacher, right? 1934, Franklin Roosevelt made it a permanent holiday after lobbyists by the Knights of Columbus made it a federal holiday. So now I had to look up Knights of Columbus, International Catholic Fraternal Service Organization, founded by Michael McGivney. Xaras, I know you know, but I wonder if the world knows. Do they know what nationality Michael McGivney was?
Well, his name gives it away. It's clearly Scotch-Irish, if not directly Irish. So
directly Irish. He is first generation Irish. His parents were Irish immigrants. Not a single thing. None of this has to do with Christopher Columbus.
Not directly. Not well, indirectly. The irony is.
I lost the date for when it actually became 1971 became a federal holiday, but only more recently did it become, a thing where people were actually getting days off and things like that. So I'm gonna let the expert history teacher break that down, the basics of like, all right, this is what it is. But I know the nuances and the things that kind of come in between that. Help me understand how a first generation Irish priest helps bring forth Columbus Day.
So, of course, let me first say that I could do so much more digging on this, right? So,
absolutely,
my knowledge is of a maybe 5-6 deep into the surface, and there's more. But But first, let me say this. I think we have to establish, and I want to establish where I'm coming from. I think that, we have to recognize that both things can be true. Unfortunately, in America, we want to live in a world of absolutes, and then we want to reframe the story to match those absolutes.
Right.
We also are a zero-sum society, so we often tend to
explain what that means.
You can't have one without it's like one or the other. You can't. Zero sum is saying like, well, I can't exist unless like, so the culture war behind, well, whose day is it, right? And it's like,
right.
Why can't we acknowledge the existence of both for all that it is? The ugly parts, the good parts of this part and that part. Like, so I think we get too caught up in, well, my story is more important, so I don't want to hear your story. That's the zero sum part of it. Like, it's always trading one thing for another instead of allowing space for both to occupy and exist. So, it's an immigration story. It's a story of various levels of wokeness that come and go, ebb and flow. Like, so we were woke, for about 5-6 years, and now people are telling us to go to sleep. That's the pattern, the historical pattern to what suits the powers that be. So you got to go back to the historical context of slavery and labor, and not just look at slavery as, oh, look what happened to Black people. Look at slavery from a larger lens of labor and cheap labor in a system that is morphing out of feudalism, right? So in the same way that someone was a serf in Europe, is the same mindset of, early Anglo, Saxon type folks before the Civil War, the British and the blue bloods, so to speak, right?
Right.
And then you get the second wave of immigration. So like you said, there's this initial introduction in 1862. Right? So you got to put that in context. That's the beginning of the Civil War. So everybody's fighting for their place in this. And what gets lost is that the population that becomes the overseers, the managers, the in-betweeners from the plantation owners and capitalists to their labor forces becomes largely the Irish and Italian. That's why in movies like Sinners, like, people, if it was lost on people why there was all this Irish play, because they're side by side, right? Same thing happens in Jamaica. You get this, the importation in some cases, even, you could argue the kidnapping of kids that are sent to Jamaica as Irish, indentured servants or slaves really to the British, but they'll be, because we're crafting whiteness at the same time capitalism is developing. You get this movement between where the Irish had pretty much been slaves to the British in Europe. That's why if you look into that story, you see all the brutality through the 1800s, the breaking off of Protestant Irish, which was really small, to Catholic Irish. You still have the hangovers from just the wars between Protestantism and Catholic beliefs in Europe, and all that comes over, right?
Right.
So the Irish place the British and those of, British, French, the upper class of Europe, European ethnicity, right? Situate the Irish still as beneath them, but as the managers of this other group that now they get to be above. So it's kind of like in America, the Irish get to realize a certain status that would not have happened in Europe,
right?
Would not have happened in the UK. The same thing happens, similar thing happens with the Italians, because by the late 1880s, so the Irish had been here much longer, anywhere from 150 to 200 years in the slave system as that managerial class. And then because they were tied, they were British Isles people. So they're coming with the British in this whole story, but they're placed still beneath the British, but above Africans in America, right? And then you start to get all the privilege that's assigned to what it means to be white. And so they're fighting for their place in the system, economically, socially, culturally. Now, 1880s come, and now you got a series of revolutions more in Eastern and Southern Europe that had already been a wave through the 1700s in Western Europe. So you start to get this exodus of Italians to America. And with that, 1862 also follows the Homestead Act, which gives away 160 acres of land to settlers that are willing to go out west.
Right.
So
right.
this is this very attractive economic draw to anybody coming from Europe. So you get all these Italians coming in, but we got to remember that America's predominant culture is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So they're Christians, but they don't fit.
Right.
They're Christians, and there's a historical European fear of the papal power, both in cultural influence and economics and property taxing, all these things that come over with the European that is now trying to be American. So the Italians experience, and often, when we hear the stories of lynching and the rise of the KKK and all those things, what gets diminished is the fact that, yes, Italians, Catholics, Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, like anybody that's falling outside of this description of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant is game for these groups that are now concerned about the same way people are today, this shifting population, demographics of population, and then how's that going to show up economically and political power? So what to me seems like 1862, you have an Irish, so to answer your question, why would an Irish father? Well, because what they had in common was being Catholic and Christian and looking for some means by which to leverage that to gain a more permanent place and status in American society, coupled with what whiteness means. So if I can shed a little bit of the European ethnicity and ascribe to what America is now taking shape and what it means to be white, is where you see them kind of positioned between all these groups. And so a lot of Columbus's story and why an Irish priest would do that, because he would benefit too, right?
Right.
If you can elevate one Catholic group, you can elevate the other.
Absolutely.
And then over time, you lose the accents, you still do some of your traditions, but now you got something to hold on to that, ironically, the Irish didn't have, right? So they don't, there isn't a story of a, and we all know Columbus is Italian, but he's flying for a Spanish flag, right? So that even unpacks it even more, right?
Right.
When you consider that the lower part of the United States, like I had to tell my students the other day, I'm like, folks get mad at Mexicans, but they were here first, right? You know that Texas on over was Mexico.
Right.
Until 1840s. Why do you think everything is Spanish? Like, and Mexico was an amalgamation of Spanish colonialism and the indigenous tribes, and how they were real sophisticated with how they broke up who was who and what power and systems that meant. So yeah, I mean, to answer your question, there is like this is where you see an Irish priest understanding that socially and politically there is something to be gained in supporting the Italians who can sort of claim this hero's journey and contribution to the development of America. Like, this story would not have happened had Columbus not thought he was in India. And that irony that to him the Americas did not exist.
Right.
That is an after story being told. So Columbus wasn't walking around like, oh, I'm in America.
Right.
He's still trying to find a route to India that's quick.
Right.
And he dies thinking that. So you also have the manipulation of a story that, and I tell my students, I was like, when we look at history, there's always going to be benefits and consequences. So you got to understand what one man's achievement is another man's consequence.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how the story is going to play out. So he gets elevated to discovered America. And then through the 90s, as you and I come along, information's more available. Dare I say we're a little awake more, because now we've got access to understand it, and people really want to tell the whole story. And and I tell my students, words matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you got to be careful. If you say discovery, what does that actually mean?
Right.
A better term might be encounter.
Right.
You
Yeah.
encounter these people, and then this is what happened. Because if you say discovery, you're implying that something didn't exist before you showed up.
Right.
But if you say encounter, you're acknowledging that there was a thing,
Mm-hmm.
and then you came. So it gets framed as this discovery. It gets framed as this great Italian contribution. But even most people even most people, Americans, let alone white people, let alone Italian, they know he was Italian, but they get missed on that. What is it? The Santa Maria. I haven't taught that part of history in a while, but these are all Spanish ships. So, all that gets lost in the story. The only thing that gets remembered is that he was Italian, and that America, perhaps wouldn't exist. I mean, you could argue that the Spanish should be mad.
Right. Right.
Like you could argue, like, why aren't you getting your story told more? So, I think that's where it begins. And by the 1920s and 30s, we go in World War I. And so you get this incredible, backlash to immigration. First, the doors are wide open.
Mm-hmm.
And the Chinese are the first to get cut off. And they get cut off in 1888 if you're a laborer. And that doesn't open back up till, 1941, where now we're looking at Chinese Revolution, fighting the Russians, communists. Okay, now we want the Chinese back. And in the midst of that, you have a Great Depression, and you have, it kind of attaches itself in an odd sort of way to the lost cause narrative of the South, the Confederacy. So at the same time, through the 20s, because if you look on the timeline, at the same time that you're getting, you got white folk of all sort of European ethnicities that are vying for their place in this melting pot of America. And the 20s and 30s sees incredible backlash on immigration and quotas and race riots and all these things that are happening between blacks and whites and a lot of people. It's not just blacks and whites. And but by the 20s and 30s now, you see the return of Democratic mayors. That at that time, the Democrat was a solid South. They were segregationists. It's through the course of the 30s that they flip-flopped. And so you've got a people that are trying, you got one set of people that are trying to perpetuate this lost cause narrative. So you get all these Confederate statues that go up.
Mm-hmm.
And that was also something that's been happening in the last 10 years, right? So while there was this reckoning about using native names, there was also a reckoning about the Confederate statues and what are you really saying by these?
Right.
And that was the DAR. So that's going up. And at the same time, then you get Italians now a generation or two in from that first wave in the 1880s and 90s that now are saying, okay, through the course of the labor movement, they're 2 generations in, they're making their space and numbers, economically. But how do they really, get a plant culturally into the story of America?
Right.
Whereby they would be fully accepted in, American whiteness, and a contribution to that story. So that's, how I was kind of framed and understood.
It makes perfect sense. I mean, it's not an absurd narrative or leap from one thing to another. I mean, it makes perfect sense, the progression and evolution of, because now, even as we're seeing, with the ICE raids and things like that, and we'll see people comment, ICE isn't going to certain neighborhoods where we know that there are large groups of European immigrants. They are not, at least that's not being shown on the news, right? And we haven't read about it. That, you know, if you're white and you're maybe from Europe, you're an immigrant, and you don't open your mouth or you master an American accent, you can blend it, like you can completely hide within America just behind being white. And I had a conversation with a gentleman the other day, kind of around this, and not more so around the Black American male's experience with the criminal legal system. And he made a very plain, assessment. He said, regardless of any interaction with the criminal legal system, it is difficult being a Black man in America, period. Period. Doesn't matter what and we've seen it play out. We've seen prominent, news journalists getting detained at their front door. You know what I mean? Because some person didn't recognize them. We see it every day that, walking while Black, jogging while Black, driving while Black, teaching while Black, being a parent, giving birth while Black, all of these things, just because the color of our skin immediately shifts the tone of any interaction. And so when you've got Europeans or, white folks coming from somewhere else into America, they have a assimilation. They have a better chance of assimilating and being unnoticed and blending in than anyone else.
Yeah. I mean, and the fact that you mentioned assimilation. So we just wrapped up looking at the policies of the Dawes Act and forced assimilation, the reservation, the adoption systems, and things that happened with Native Americans. So, I mean, assimilation was the brand of the day. I mean, melting pot theory makes it sound really safe.
Right.
But the mechanisms that create the melting pot are very dangerous for some and not for others, right? So,
right, the consequence that you talked about.
Yeah, and like you said, so there was a point where it was much more dangerous to be Italian. It was much more dangerous to be amongst the labor movements in the late 1880s, early 1900s, because most of those were European immigrants that were seen as second class, seen as unworthy. You're talking about the Gilded Age, like people just stepped over them and didn't want no parts. One of the movies we watched is Far and Away. We're almost there, like to kind of encapsulate this period. And there's a scene where Tom Hanks and Nicole Kidman are Irish immigrants, and she's upper class, he's lower class. But when they get to America, it didn't matter. She gets leveled in that movie, like brought down. Like nobody cares here about your inheritance or anything. You were just Irish, and you're no better than me. And they're out in the streets and they're looking for work, and it's cold, and the guy says to them, "I don't hire Irish," and the kids are kind of like, "Whoo," especially when it hits for some of them that are like recognize or identify with that, right?
Right,
like,
right,
really?
yeah.
And I'm like, no, really, like,
like they did
really,
white
that, like, that's what it was. Listen to, and that's a Ron Howard movie where he does very good with historical accuracy, right? But now here we are 3 or 4 generations later, and those same descendants now have lost the language, they've lost the history. It's been manufactured for all of us.
Right.
So we get lost on that too, that a lot of the stories are about the intersection of race and class and political economic power. So there's always a group, and the reality is a lot of that group, if you really want to dig, a lot of that group that's in that 1 to 10%, they got lineage going back before the Civil War. So they've always kind of been puppeteering this thing, and so in many ways what I try to bring forth is, rather than getting caught up in I don't like you, and a lot of that is because that's my background. I'm 23% Scotch Irish. My last name is Collins. You look at my face, you look at my file, it's evident and obvious. So from And I've struggled through all that in my life. So I come with a place of both things can be true,
Mm-hmm.
both things can exist. We can tell the true story of Columbus. Yes, he had an encounter with America that transformed the very direction of global history.
Mm-hmm.
That's a fact.
Right.
When you frame it that way. When you say he discovered, and now you're playing with words and reality.
Right.
You can also say that his impact, well, beneficial to some, was consequential to others, right?
Right.
So here comes Indigenous Peoples Day. Um, and I totally get like what you said, where someone like, I don't need a day, because that's how Black folk feel sometimes. Like,
Mhm.
I don't need all your firsts, anymore. But nevertheless, um, I think it's more apropos for us as a society to say, why can't we just recognize both?
Mhm.
Columbus had an encounter with America in 1492 that established the Columbian exchange of trade, and while it included a transatlantic slave trade, there also was a sub-Saharan Arab slave trade too, right? So, but anyway, so why can't we say that that's true, but frame it in its accuracy? It was an
Right.
encounter that led to an opening that would change everything for the future, for the good and the bad. And then in that, you can elevate the, really uplift the story of well, so not, instead of acting like we don't want to talk about the ugly parts, which is part of what this administration wants us to do. It wants us to go back
Mhm.
and say, we're not going to talk about the ugly parts. That's ridiculous.
Right.
Americans, my students are more mature than that. Why can't adults be? Like,
Yeah.
that whole thing when they're like, you hurt the kids' feelings. I'm like, the kids barely feel about. They're like, what do I need to do? I mean, I'm not, discounting, but when I'm talking to the ninth grader, they're like, yeah, I hear you. I mean, I get it, and I know
Right.
it might pop back up later on, the brevity of what I'm saying, but
Right.
I hate that argument like that the kids can't handle. Children have always been more capable. Adults like to manipulate children just as much as they want to manipulate each other. So
Right.
I think you can elevate both stories and tell the truth, because if you tell the truth, then this pattern stops. But because you haven't told the truth, here we are in 2025, and the policies, the actions, the mechanism, the tools
Mhm.
haven't changed.
Right.
The faces have shifted, but the powers that be actually have not. And using things, saying like, and this is what kills me, when I'm talking about this, and I get stuck in it, is because people want to make the past seem so much the past. But here's the president talking about the Insurrection Act, invoking the insurrection, everything
Mhm.
that a lot of the laws that he's using to try to invoke this sort of enforcement are
Right.
going back to a time when it was unabashedly racist, and it led to things like, I was talking with one of my colleagues today, and we were sharing some just cultural things that we try to touch on. He was like, yeah, I was doing something with Strange Fruit,
Mm.
Billie Holiday. And I said, yeah. And there's different places you can pick that up. And we were getting into, and I said, yeah, we shared with the kids, like, the song was actually a poem by a Jewish man named Aber Morpool, who would
Mhm.
later on, and he taught me this today, right? Today, I just learned, fun fact, that this man adopted the children of Sacco and Vanzetti, which was a trial where Italian immigrants were put to death under the auspices of, communist insurrectionist activities, sort of thing.
Wow.
So we've been here before, right? I mean, and that's the part where I'm like, you got to elevate both truths. I'm not going to tell Italians to not celebrate what's important to them. That's wrong to me.
Right.
That's wrong to me. I also think it's wrong for anybody to turn around and say, well, we're not going to acknowledge the indigenous story. Both of those are wrong to me. So I am a supporter of, let's two things can be true. And as a society, diversity and inclusion have become dirty words. Why? Because they want you to go back to fighting and arguing like the Facebook post yesterday with Nars
Right.
Brown was like, seriously? And then I was kind of disappointed with Narsound because like, well, you took one side, so you should have anticipated this
Right.
reaction because now people feel offended when you didn't have to offend. You could have just said, "Hey, it's both days,
Hmm.
and let's talk about it."
Right. Exactly. That's
Could have
why.
done
That's why.
that.
That is exactly why we're having this conversation today, because somebody has to initiate. Somebody has to be the bigger person, and for some god awful reason, it's always me. Why do I always have to be the voice of reason? Why do I always have to be the bigger person? Why do I not get to crash out and have a tantrum? And God is like, no, because this is what I want you to do. This is what I want you to say. These are who I want you to pull together. Because and as I'm listening to you talk, and I'm thinking like, you know what I mean? If we start to engage, what's the benefit and the consequence if we really start to engage? One, doing away with that zero sum rhetoric and notion, and that we actually begin to practice truth telling. Two things can be real can exist at the same time. Two things can be true, and come from and that you don't lose anything from that.
You
You
only
don't
lose in the
lose
zero
anything.
sum because the zero sum turns out to be
Zero. Absolutely. So it's like, okay, as I wrote in a grant, we are modeling what we want to see other people do, because, I do have a tendency to kind of, my knee jerk reaction is, oh no, F that, you know what I mean? But having this conversation with you, you know what I mean? I was like, well, you know what? I'm a reasonable person. And yeah, there's enough space, there's enough air, there's enough everything for everyone. And it should not, you know, people have to, like you said, grow up. You know what I mean? Adults have a tendency to be more childish and manipulative than children. They put all of those things on the children and blame the children for, their bad behavior. And it's like kids, up until a certain age, I think just operate in truth. They don't know anything different. You know what I mean? And that's from the place from which they function. And if we paid more attention to how our young people are experiencing living and carrying out how they handle differences and things that look different, more with curiosity and wanting to understand versus let me kill it. You know what I mean? Because it looks different than me, or it sounds different. It, you know what I mean? Walks different, prays different, sings different. Like, we have to start seeing that, okay, yeah, like you said, two things can exist at once.
and so let's take it to, like, so you said like it's children, right? I think another thing that has greatly influenced me, not just my personal story as, half Creole, 23% Scotch Irish. You see it in my face, you see it in my kids, you see it in my name. But I'm also Black. I got challenged on that left and right, But another thing that has been so important, I think, and I find it very unique to at least the age group that I grew up. We grew up in Norristown, right? And we came through in a time when my friends were Irish, they were Italian, they were Polish, they were Black, and we were all in each other's houses. We played games together, we played sports, we did all that. We understood each other. What we had in common was we were all working class in Norristown.
Right.
We were all largely working class. Some in the factories, some in the offices, but for the most part, we was all just getting by. And I know it was a sweet spot because when I talk, I came through in the 90s, largely the 90s. But I know when I talk to some people, the 80s, that's where this transition happens. Because I hear some people talk about, well, certain parts of the West End, you couldn't go, this, that, and the other. And I was like, yeah, I kind of remember that. Like, so, it kind of shifted. So there was a good 30, 40 years, like where, I think when I talk to the people I grew up from Norristown, the worldliness that we have, the broad vision that we have is because we weren't cut off from each other.
Right.
We actually knew each other and we knew our families. And whether you went to the High, you had a lot of people that went to Kenrick and St. Paul's. So they may have been Catholic, but then they experienced that diversity of being Catholic. So I say that to say, I always, one of the things I always say about growing up in Norristown is it gave me this unique lens by which I knew so much about other people from a people level that I could appreciate what it meant to be people. And you got ethnic differences, but
Right.
I didn't we didn't grow up with a lot of the hate, which is sometimes disappointing when I see people in their adulthood and I'm like, that was not you when you were growing up. I don't know what happened, but that
Right.
wasn't you when I knew you. When we was playing on the lacrosse team together and all that.
Right.
That was
Yeah.
folks was playing football together. Everybody talks about the heyday under Roger Groves. What was that? That was a football team of people from all, when my generation posts their pictures, they're all white, black together,
Right.
and they are brothers.
Right.
So if that happened, why can't that be reflected? But it happened because it was a natural, organic interaction and understanding, and we broke bread at each other's tables, and our mothers and fathers looked out for us just the same. You was gonna get checked by white,
Didn't
black,
matter.
or other. Like,
Right.
so I always take from that I think we had a very unique experience in town in
Right.
the 90s and the early 2000s. But then, what happened? The next generation moved
Swings.
out. The second generation wanted bigger houses. They didn't want the row homes. And so it became less Italian, became less Polish, it became less Irish. It became, so some of the angst I see, like when I think about that post is, that when people are like, oh, Norristown changed so much. Well, I mean, it's a working class. That's the pattern of working class towns. So, but the funny thing is like, well, here we are, and the large population that is now the target of Americans' immigration policy is also largely what faith?
Catholic.
Yep.
And
extremely devout in their own right. When you think
very
about,
much.
How Hispanic people practice Catholicism.
Yeah.
St. Pat's was a dying church until the largely Mexican population moved in.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you got all these intersections, but we don't want to talk about it. We just rather sit here and argue about whether the fountain is running this week or that it hasn't in the last 10 years. That wasn't lost on me. I said, oh, so now because everybody's trying to vie for their space and their look, now you want to pay attention. The fountain has been dormant because most of the people that wanted it there, Columbus Day, for those of you that are watching, it's a fountain in Elmwood Park that, and I also caution the word celebrate. You said that earlier. See, again, words matter.
Right.
There's memorialize, there's commemorate, there's celebrate. I mean, they're all about a recognition, but the nuances matter. So maybe if we stop saying celebrate and maybe just say recognize, you get a different vibe in how you react. Like, that fountain wasn't lost on me. I kind of snickered to myself. Now we're gonna clean up the weeds. Oh, you got the water running. Look at that.
Right. And again, for one day, I mean, this should be, and I'll say this, we're all guilty of, when it comes time, it's getting close to that day that we gear up and pay more attention. So like you said, it was running all week. There was a truck out there making sure that, things were getting done and in preparation for the day. I don't know if they had anybody out there speaking or doing anything, not that I saw. But, and I think back to your point. Well, one thing that you said, when the young people, the kids that you grew up with, played field hockey and all of that stuff with, and they've gone different paths, like they never had the interaction of growing up in working class Norristown alongside the most diverse population they could imagine, that helped shape who they are and probably lent to the success that they're experience right now, I guess it's like that phenomenon of like when you make it out, like I'm never going back. I'm not going to even acknowledge where I came from. You know what I mean? Because they're embarrassed, or that, you know, they don't see the value or the benefit in it, or for some reason it makes them less than their accomplishments. And it's like, it's because of them that you have these accomplishments. And it's unfortunate that, you know, I don't know if it's a mental health thing or if it's just ego and pride and, you know, all these other things that, you know, cause people to like ignore their heritage. I'm biracial. You know what I'm saying? They're like, Heather, you're black and you're this, you're that. My mother is white. I have a whole side of family that's Polish and German and all of these things. I don't denounce, I don't deny, but I'm also, I'm very focused on, and I've always been like this, for the underdog. Anyone that's being bullied, Heather's going to say something. Heather's going to stand in the gap. Heather's going to get in it, because right is right and wrong is wrong. It doesn't matter who you are.
Yeah.
And so it's just really unfortunate that people become slaves to those types of things, because it robs you of your joy, it robs you of your happiness, it robs you of authentic relationships and being free. You know what I mean? Where you don't have to worry about hiding, you know, like if they see you, you know, do they even speak? You know what I mean? Act like they don't see you, you know what I mean, in the grocery store, because it would remind them that they come from Norristown, and people just make Norristown like it's this horrible place. And it's like, no, Norristown has produced some amazing people, amazing, you know, things, and still holding on to do amazing things. So, you know, for all those that, you know, I'm not from Norristown, you know what I mean? Either. I didn't grow up in Norristown. I grew up in Lansdale.
I forget that all the time because you are so in it.
I mean, I've been in Norristown 25 years.
You are adjacent.
Yeah, you know what I mean? I couldn't tell you like all the 5 families and all that kind of stuff. I'm like, who? Y'all identify people by which street they, oh, Miss Francis, I grew up on Jacoby Street, and Miss so-and-so, that's on such and such street. Yeah. And Miss Jackie, which one? The one that was on Green and or whatever? Like, y'all are wild. You know, that's how, you know, you identify folks, and it's such a unique thing to watch, and it should be celebrated. It's like, I don't know that happens anywhere else. You know, and so it's just unfortunate that people kind of just fall into that because they want to be, you know, I think nothing different than, you know, in 1862 when all of these things were happening and they were jockeying for position and trying to find out who they are. But I think at this point we should know. You should know.
That's the part. Yeah. Like, why are we still repeating the same stuff? Why are we still allowing ourselves to be victim to the, you know, pardon my French, the bullshit of the puppeteers that benefit from when the races and the benefit from the divisions, whether it's race, political, they're benefiting from that. And again, like I said earlier, when you go back and when you look at who some of these really power players are, they've been playing this playbook since, you know, the American Revolution.
Yeah. Centuries.
And in their circles, you know, quietly that's the marker of entrance, you know, into certain elite clubs is you know, for people to understand what it means to be blue blood. And it holds 2 connotations, you know, whether you can see, you know, the veins or how far back you go. So it's very disappointing to think like, here we are again, repeating the same old thing, and we are in a new gilded age, whereby there is a 1%, but this time it's not an industrial revolution, it's a tech revolution. But that's just the that's the what, the whys and hows, they haven't changed, and so, you know, like I say to my students, I was like, well, you know, I mean, people saying we don't want woke. I was like, well, what's the opposite? You know, like sleep. And I'm like, well, what does it mean to be sleep? I was like, well, you know, sleep. Well, no one goes, not paying attention. I was like, right, like let's get out of the literal and let's get into the figurative. Like, so, and then they go, Oh. And I
Right.
told them that I've been telling them for the last 2 weeks. I was like, y'all look, but you don't see. You see
Mhm.
pictures, you see words, but very few of them are actually
Right.
making sense. And that's the criticism, even of the young people with social media and things, is because it's just flashing in front of you. And, then I had to break it down today. I was like, and at the same token, you hear, but you don't listen. You hear my voice, but that's why I got to keep asking you to be quiet, because you hear my voice, but you're not listening to the words that are coming out of my mouth.
Absolutely.
Well, here
Absolutely.
we are, and people were upset about whose day is it. Really? Is
It's
that what we're really
everybody's
here
day
for?
that woke up that day. If you woke up today, it's your day.
For all of us, when you really just get out of human flaws that then get manipulated and you just stand there as a human, it's like, yeah. And everybody's got a story to tell. Yes, some more than others. And some of that depends on geography, right?
Right. Yeah.
You had a black man in America and what that experience is. But if you were a Jew in Europe, hey,
Mhm.
I dare not say certain words, but if you're in certain parts of the Middle East and who you are, so
Absolutely.
everybody's got. If you're in Africa, if you're in Asia, none of us are untouched by some story of oppression. I mean, even in the people in power, a lot of their actions are rooted in their own generational, historical group trauma that keeps them, wanting to can't exist unless they exist on the back of someone else.
Right.
That's the really danger of it all. What I mean by the zero sum.
Yeah.
Why does your existence only defined by your position against another and a being above? Why does that have to be? So we're missing out.
Yeah.
I'm gonna eat me some Irish potatoes, and I love my pierogies, and and that's the hypocrisy you see people saying. So you're gonna
Right.
eat the tacos, but you want to put me out.
Right.
You
Right.
can't do both.
Drink margaritas and celebrate Cinco de Mayo.
All of it. I'm with it. But like you said earlier, that's what has allowed people that came from Norristown. I'm comfortable in any setting.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care what race it is. I don't care the level of money. I might prefer something over another. I'm human. I'm allowed my preferences. But the fact that I'm not fearful of being in all these spaces is because I grew up here and I was in and moving around all these spaces. So for Narsound, I hope we can hold on while others want us to continue to divide.
Right.
And as a nation as a whole, I hope we can learn to accept that two things can be true. You can tell the story and just tell both stories. Just tell the truth. Just do that. Not hard.
I love it. I love it. And so this is a perfect opportunity to come to my favorite part of the show is our what the fuck moment. And this episode of What the Fuck is brought to you by the Lenape or Delaware tribes of the Tri-County region.
I
Okay.
feel like I'm on what's his name? John oh my god, why am I losing him now? What's his name on HBO? John
Stewart?
not Stewart. Oh, the other guy, the British guy. He's hilarious.
Oh, I don't know his
Oh
name.
god, I'm having a blank, but he always has in the middle of his segment, he just goes left and goes there. So all
Right,
right.
we just had this high level, high function, high thought process, and yeah, we gonna. What I love Cardi B. She said, "When you go low, I'm gonna take you to hell."
That's the part you mentioned. Cardi B. It's funny because sometimes I want to be irked, and then other times, like the other day, she was talking about her 4 kids and my grandmama's raised 12, 13. How dare I act like this is hard? And I'm like, yo, sometimes Cardi B dropping gems Even
Facts.
when I don't want to hear it, I'm like, you know what?
And her grandmama is still around. I just seen her in a picture with her grandmama today. And flipping everybody's words. So yeah. Look, it's the truth, and it is, and you gotta laugh. You gotta be able to, because that was really heavy, and it was deep, and it was really educational, and it's rooted in history, and you know what I mean. Some hard truths that people don't want to hear, some hard pills to swallow for some folks who have been exercising those types of behaviors that aren't becoming. And so I think it hit a lot of people. Hopefully it hit a lot of people where it needed to be hit, where they needed to be hit. You know what I mean? So if you have a WTF moment, I would love to hear it. However, I do have, because, we talked a lot about, what'd you say?
No, I was like, tell me where your Lenape and Delaware.
So with preparing for tonight's conversation, my assistant has ancestral roots here in Pennsylvania. Her grandfather is from the Lenape tribe. And one of the things that she said to me, and we're not going to go down this rabbit hole because we will have this conversation and we will invite you back. But she said, why didn't the white people enslave Native Americans? And she said, because they couldn't.
Yes.
And she and I had a very deep, very similar conversation about that. And I was like, yes, we are going to have this conversation on air. Okay. I love, because the same way with evolution, if we came from monkeys, why are they still monkeys? You know what I'm saying? So it's like, that is something I never thought about. Never thought about it.
No,
never. I mean, when we started talking about it, of course, it made perfect sense because we understand why they had to go then to Africa and kidnap people and bring them to someplace completely foreign where they had nothing.
Right.
Native Americans, that's my town. That's
you
my
answered
shit.
your own question. Like, there's the answer.
Absolutely.
Right there. Like, and most people don't, they get so hung up on slavery. Like, it's like they miss that. They tried the natives first.
Right.
First of all, it was their home. You can't tell. It's like chasing somebody through the alleys. Like, you don't live here, but this person over, they know all the ways to duck.
Right. You don't know where it dip at. You don't know where the hole is and underneath the porch.
So you couldn't do that. And then the unfortunate side effect of that encounter was disease. And that was an unintended consequences until they figured out, we'll just put the smallpox blankets right in there, right? Like, and then it became intentional. So that wasn't working.
Can't beat them.
And then you go to indentured servants. So there comes the Irish.
Right.
Back to what we were talking about. There comes the Irish, the indentured servant. But that indentured servant, now as you start to introduce Black people, well, like you said, they are white. If you're now making this racial construct, they're white. They have an now of freedom, land, and opportunity, which then breeds a lot of the conflict that largely is more between white groups. Even when you look at the Civil War, that was between white groups. Even right now, some of the things you're seeing, that's why people are like, why Black people so quiet? Because it ain't our fight. Like until you make it ours, and that's also the stoking of the fire too, right? Trying to make it the others, but fun facts of what people don't know. And so my what the F moment in that would be me trying to bring home to my students that the colonies, in comparison to the West, so I'm like, if you go west of the Mississippi, Native indigenous populations are prevalent. I was in San Antonio last year, and it was like, oh, there was indigenous people everywhere. So I had to remind them that, like, well, east of the Mississippi, that settling started in the 1700s. So for the most part, they had successfully wiped out and reduced what were and then, not Lenape, but Lenape, because that's what most people are, Lenape, right? So they reduced all that. So you don't see that presence Whereas east of the Mississippi, that was only 100 years ago. Some people are very much still here and persisting
Right.
in their living. So that's like kind of my W2F to the kids. It's like no,
Mhm.
just it's not familiar to you because the geography of where we are
Right.
and the history of that geography. So I'll keep it saying. I mean, I got a lot of the other WTF.
Absolutely, and we're gonna get a bunch of we'll have some of those little nuggets because we see what's happening in our school district, and I think we've talked about this before, and how they're whitewashing history and how they're changing history and how they're deleting history, and it's like it is literally up to us. When you call it the Gilded Age, and what is this era, and we've been talking about it at least within our movement space, defining our era. And when I was in Montgomery, Alabama a few weeks ago at the Legacy Museum, the era was defined for us. It's called Truth and Justice.
Yeah.
And it may not be somebody, everybody's era, but I know for me, that's the era that I'm working in and embodying is truth and justice. Because if we're not telling the truth, good, bad, indifferent, ugly, whatever it is, we have to tell the truth.
Yeah.
We have to.
Yep. Because
We
we're
have to
experiencing all the things right now, right? We're in a third Reconstruction. We're in a new Gilded Age. I mean, so many things post-Civil War have all come down on us at the same time. So if anything is an opportunity to do different, is like you said, where do we actually authentically, participate in truth and reconciliation? Where do we not be so arrogant as a nation to not look to places like when Trump brought them Afrikaners over? I'm like, stop it. Because what you should be focusing on is the truth and reconciliation practices, the economic land redistribution. You found a pocket to manipulate and to exploit, when the larger story is a story of government, social, and economically led reconstruction. Is it perfect? No. But was it more intentional? You don't want to acknowledge what Germany did to acknowledge what happened and to put things both in policy and education to say we're not going to do this again. We don't want, as a society, Americans especially, as a whole, don't want to acknowledge that there are folks that benefit from that. But you're also talking about those two examples are states that have a more. Germany was one of your first socialist countries, if you will, from its unification and offering pension plans and education and all these things that the U.S. would toy with.
Right.
It was too beneficial to market it rather than to and exploit it than to share it. So maybe this moment, maybe we could try to do something different.
I mean, I think we have the knowledge. I think we have the expertise. We have the courage, you know what I mean, to kind of push back and the ability to communicate in real time, across, hundreds of miles, and just kind of unite in solidarity. I think there's a lot of movement and things. And one more thing, which also prompted our conversation is, I think you touched on a little bit earlier, is like white guilt. You know what I mean? There are white folks that, what about they're putting their guilt on the children, trying to protect the children. And ultimately, they're just trying to protect their own feelings and their guilt about all the bad things that a certain number of white folks did. And I read a quote that said, well, maybe you're focusing on the wrong white people, because there were plenty of white people that stood in the gap, gave their lives, fought for equality, fought for justice, and the equal treatment of people of color and indigenous and all of that. And it's like, yeah, you're focusing on the wrong white folks then, but they're not celebrating, those white folks aren't being elevated.
And
you know what I mean?
Build on that. I think it's one more thing than guilt. I think guilt is a low-hanging fruit, right? That's the first emotion. Not me, right? But the emotion that I think really can't be confronted is a sense of betrayal. And not from the outside, but from the inside. The sense that what you thought about the world, it's like one of the English classes was watching the Truman Show. And if you're familiar with, Jim Carrey in the Truman Show, his life is a reality show, but he thinks it's reality until the sun falls and it's a lamp, and then he goes to the wall and realizes, like, and so I think that is the more deeper sort of psychosis. Is that if I accept this other truth, then how does that undo everything I thought about the world and how I've always navigated in the world and what I thought about the people I trusted to inform me on the world? If I fully listen to you, now I got to question, well, Mom, why did you always say that? Dad, why did you talk like this? Why did everybody at church say this? Why, now you got to confront. So I think white guilt is the low-hanging fruit. That's that first emotion. Like, oh, what
right. Yeah.
That's the defense. But the one that you don't want to unpack
that you need
is the sense of betrayal that I've been deliberately misled, and that they might actually have to, then if they ask the questions, you might talk to people that don't, you're asking relatives telling you something and they can't tell you why either. So now not only are you feeling betrayed and misled, now you're feeling lost, because some of you might not be able to actually track where and how you've started down this path. And that, we know individually what it's like when your world gets turned upside down and you feel like everything you knew was a lie. In just personal family interactions, right? So imagine as a society, and I think that's the harder piece, the harder pill for many to swallow is, if I really acknowledge this, then I gotta acknowledge the full story that I was deliberately being misled, and to whose advantage? Why? Did I benefit from it? Okay, if I did, then the guilt circles back around. Right? But then if you're poor white, you don't feel guilty. You feel angry. You feel angry because I was misled and I'm not benefiting.
Right. And I could have sat over at Miss Jackie's house and been eating some fried chicken, and I could have been bringing the iced tea, and we could have been coming up together.
Miss Jackie took care of me, but now you tell me to hate Miss Jackie. And then what did you do for me? Nothing. You just told me because I look like this, that should just work out. So I think those are the deeper things that white guilt is an easy way to say it, but it's also inflammatory. I think it's a deeper thing to really examine the psychosis of feeling misled and deliberately betrayed, and especially if it didn't work out for you.
Right. And I'll add one more layer, because now what does that say about you as an individual? Like your discernment, that you were so easily duped, that you didn't do your due diligence, that you just blindly believed this and followed it, absorbed it, made it a part of, wove it into the fabric of your being without question.
And that can go both ways, because in the same way you can get a Black extremist, separatist. The extremes are functioning on the same level. Well, the topic is different, but the behaviors and the mindset are coming from the same wound.
Right. Absolutely. Wow. That's deep. That's deep. And we're going to end it on that. And I have to do like all of our, like, I want to end on being deep and just sit in that. I definitely want folks to sit in that. And so can you just pop up the flyers? I don't really want to talk over it, so that we can just kind of sit in that.
Okay. Yep. Everybody should break bread together, have a drink together, have a smoke.
Yeah.
Ask your curiosities. Like some of my most impactful, and I'll wrap up on this. A story I often tell in the willingness to share, right, is I remember in high school having some of my white girlfriends say, why don't you wash your hair every day?
Right.
And me saying, well, why do you? and then having a conversation that just understand who we were. I'm like, to understand that, like, well, genetically, your face is dry, your hair is oily. Our face is oily, our hair is dry. So if I wash it every day, and then even matter of fact, like, you probably shouldn't wash it every day either. Like,
Right,
but
you really shouldn't.
it was such an innocuous curiosity, but it always stuck with me that, like, yeah, this is how you get to know people. This is how you get to know. I'm curious why. Be with tact. Don't
Right,
be
yeah.
like intrusive and offensive, but a lot of handicapped people would rather you just treat them the same or just ask than to be looking like, yeah. So I'll end on that. Like,
Yeah.
Find out your questions and your curiosity. Talk to the people. If that person's offended, they ain't the right one. Move on. There's another one that's going to say, sure, I'll talk to you about it.
People love to talk about themselves. They love to talk about themselves. And so with that, I'll say, get a therapist.
I have one.
I have one too.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's how we can have this conversation. You know what I mean? We're doing the work and we're exploring and sitting in things that are uncomfortable and giving it time to marinate and without being quick to judgment or thought or whatever, just sit in it. So yeah, folks, I encourage you all, find a therapist to kind of work out some of these struggles. While you're on this earth, so that you can have, remaining good days.
And with that, make a friend with somebody that don't look like you.
Absolutely. X, I love you. I appreciate you. And folks, you know what I mean? This we are gearing up to make this a thing. So you're gonna learn today. I don't know what we're gonna call it.
I like that time. Oh, that's how I talk to my students. I code switch like crazy in front of them. I go right back and forth. I'm like, you're gonna learn today. And then I'll go drop all my big words and elevate. And I'm like, you see how I do this? You can do
the Yes, absolutely. So you're gonna learn today. Stay tuned. It's gonna come at you full force 2026. Yes. All right, X. I'll talk to you later. Peace, y'all.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Purely Speculation. If you learned something, share something. Please like, follow, and share this show. The more our communities know, the more they are empowered and the faster we can create change. Purely Speculation would not be made possible without the generous support of the Community Justice Exchange, the Health Sparks Frank E. Boston Black Justice Fund, Philadelphia Foundation, and Reform Alliance. Thank you. Booyah!
Intuition different, already lived and dreamt it. Visions make my vision clear as I'm jogging through this fog of life. I be fog like what the fuck said. Body and I'm all set. Baby, can you be my Cardi B on an offset? Toast we got itself, we building still materials.